They thought money made them untouchable. In a glittering ballroom filled with the world's elite, a billionaire family laughed behind champagne glasses as they mocked a young woman for the color of her skin and the simplicity of her dress. They didn't know who she was, or how powerful her silence would be. Moments later, the smiles froze, the music stopped, and whispers spread like wildfire. A single decision would shatter a $750 million deal they'd been bragging about all evening, dragging their empire into chaos. What happened inside that room became the most talked-about scandal in corporate history, because that woman wasn't just anyone. She was the daughter of the black CEO they desperately needed. The city skyline glowed like liquid gold under the setting sun, skyscrapers stretching toward a crimson horizon. In the heart of this opulent empire stood the Harrington Tower, a monument to wealth and dominance. Inside, preparations were underway for an event that would dominate business headlines by morning, a private gala hosted by the Harrington family, celebrating what they believed would be the largest merger of the decade. A $750 million deal that would secure their global supremacy. Everything about the evening screamed power. Valet attendants lined the marble driveway. Luxury cars formed an endless procession, and crystal chandeliers cast shimmering light over the grand hall. Every detail was curated to impress the world's most influential investors. This was not just a party, it was a statement of control. Amid the polished elegance and designer gowns, the Harringtons were the undisputed monarchs of the night. Richard Harrington, the patriarch, was a man whose wealth insulated him from consequence. To his right, Eleanor, his wife, played the part of the perfect socialite, her smile as sharp as the diamonds dripping from her neck. Their two children, Bradley and Victoria, moved like royalty among guests, their arrogance wrapped in silk and charm. Tonight, they were celebrating more than just money. They were celebrating dominance over their competitors. For months, they had been negotiating with Titan Global, a powerhouse corporation that would open doors they had only dreamed of. The CEO of Titan Global was known for his discretion and intelligence, a man whose approval meant access to markets others couldn't even imagine. For Richard, this merger was his legacy. But there was one detail the Harringtons didn't know. One silent variable in their flawless equation. Across the city, in a quiet suite overlooking the same glowing skyline, a young woman adjusted the simple strap of her evening dress. No glittering jewels, no entourage, no borrowed designer gown. She chose elegance without excess, a statement that whispered rather than screamed. Her name was Amara Caldwell, and though the Harringtons had never heard of her, her presence at the gala would change everything. Amara wasn't the kind of woman who courted attention. Reserved yet commanding, her strength was the kind you couldn't measure in wealth or fame. She had grown up in rooms where she was underestimated, in circles where power came with a price, where her father taught her that dignity was worth more than diamonds. That lesson would become her armor tonight. She had no intention of making a scene, no desire to dominate the spotlight. She was there for one reason: to observe, to understand the family that was courting her father's empire. But as fate would have it, the evening would spiral into something far beyond observation. When Amara stepped into the grand ballroom, her presence was like a quiet ripple in a roaring sea. The Harringtons noticed her only briefly, a face they didn't recognize, wearing a dress that didn't scream designer exclusivity. To them, she was background, another name on the long guest list of social climbers hoping to taste their world. But others noticed her for different reasons. There was something about the way she carried herself, an ease that didn't match her surroundings, yet didn't bend to them either. Her poise drew silent admiration from those who understood that true power never needs to announce itself. As the evening unfolded, laughter and clinking glasses filled the air. Richard Harrington worked the room like a maestro conducting a symphony, ensuring every note of praise returned to him. Speeches were made, deals were whispered, and cameras captured carefully curated moments for tomorrow's headlines. The Harringtons were basking in their own perfection, blind to the storm inching closer with every passing second. Near the center of the room, Eleanor Harrington's eyes swept over the guests like a queen surveying her court. When her gaze landed on Amara, her perfectly lined lips curled into something between amusement and disdain. A subtle nudge to Victoria, a whisper behind a manicured hand, and the first seeds of mockery were planted. They didn't know her name. They didn't know her purpose. They only saw a young black woman who, in their eyes, didn't belong. And that was enough for them to decide she was unworthy of their respect. It started small, a glance here, a smirk there, but privilege has a way of amplifying cruelty. Soon the whispers became sharper, echoing louder in the gilded corners of the room. A laugh disguised as conversation, a joke cloaked in elegance. They thought no one noticed. They thought it was harmless. But someone noticed. Several people, in fact. And though Amara kept her composure, their mockery would cost them more than they could imagine. Because the very empire they were flaunting tonight, the deal they were celebrating as sealed, was tethered to a man whose world revolved around the quiet strength standing just a few feet away. As the orchestra played, its final note of the evening's opening, the stage was set, not for the Harringtons' triumph, but for their unraveling. In the next few hours, a chain of events would ignite that not even their billions could stop. And it would all begin with a smile. A small, knowing smile on the face of the woman they tried to humiliate. The gala moved into full swing, a spectacle of indulgence bathed in golden light. Waiters floated through the crowd with silver trays, offering champagne that sparkled like liquid sunlight. Laughter rose in crescendos as alliances were forged in whispered deals and fleeting smiles. For the Harringtons, this was their kingdom, a stage where every gesture was a performance and every compliment a calculated move. Richard Harrington stood like a monarch at the center of it all, one hand resting on a crystal glass, the other clutching the future he believed was already his. Tonight's event wasn't just about celebrating. It was about power on display. Every eye in the room told him he had won. The Titan global deal, the whispers of expansion, the silent acknowledgement of supremacy. It was intoxicating. But in the shadows of their triumph stood Amara Caldwell. Unassuming in her presence, yet commanding without a word, she navigated the room with quiet grace. She didn't need to belong to this glittering world of excess. Her confidence was rooted in something deeper, legacy, intellect, and a sense of purpose no amount of wealth could mimic. From across the room, the Harrington siblings noticed her again. Victoria, draped in emerald silk and dripping in diamonds, leaned toward her brother with a smirk that could cut glass. Their laughter followed like perfume, sickly sweet and lingering. To them, Amara was an anomaly, a disruption in their curated circle of perfection. She must have come with one of the staff, Victoria mused under her breath, her words meant for no one but her brother. Bradley chuckled, adjusting the cufflinks that bore his family crest. The arrogance in his smile was almost theatrical. What began as whispers soon became theater. They commented on her dress, simple but elegant. They dissected her presence with the precision of predators circling prey. Each remark was sharper than the last, a private game in which cruelty was currency. To their friends, it was harmless amusement. To Amara, it was familiar, too familiar. She had seen this before, in boardrooms where her ideas were dismissed until repeated by someone else. In conferences where her name was forgotten while lesser minds basked in unearned glory. And now, here it was again, wrapped in silk and champagne, disguised as sophistication. But Amara wasn't here to fight battles that didn't matter. Her purpose was bigger than their ignorance. Her father, the man they were desperate to impress, believed in diplomacy, measured moves, never reactive. Tonight was about observation, But even observation has its limits, and theirs was inching closer with every mocking glance. As the evening progressed, the Harringtons' contempt became harder to hide. When Eleanor Harrington approached Amara, it was under the pretense of civility. Her smile was a mask, flawless and brittle. Her words dripped with honey laced in venom. Compliments that weren't compliments at all, inquiries that felt like interrogations. "Where did you find that dress? It's refreshingly modest." A tilt of the head, a lingering look, the unspoken message, "You don't belong here." Around them, guests watched, some out of curiosity, others out of discomfort. But no one intervened. In circles like these, silence was survival. Amara, however, wasn't just another guest seeking approval. She answered politely, each response calm and deliberate, her composure unshaken. If Eleanor expected embarrassment, she found none. If Victoria anticipated humiliation, she was met with quiet strength. That only fueled their disdain. To people, like them, confidence without pedigree was insolence. Then came the moment that shifted everything. A careless laugh, a whisper that wasn't as discreet as intended. Victoria's voice, clear enough to pierce the air. "People like her should stick to charity events, not boardroom galas." Laughter followed, hers, Bradley's, and a few who clung to their favor like lifelines. It was a sound Amara knew well, the sound of doors closing, the sound of judgment passed by those who never understood the weight of what they dismissed. For a brief second her chest tightened, not from shame, but from the memory of countless moments just like this. But then, something inside her shifted. Not anger, not indignation, clarity. Because in that instant, Amara realized two things. They didn't know who she was. They were about to find out in a way they would never forget. Still, she said nothing. She didn't need to. Power, she had learned, isn't loud. It's quiet. It's patient. And it strikes when the stage is set. The announcement came just as dessert was being served, a shimmering display of gold-dusted confections and champagne towers. Richard Harrington took the stage, his confidence swelling as cameras turned toward him. He tapped the microphone, his smile spreading like a well-rehearsed act. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice booming through the hall, "tonight we celebrate more than success. We celebrate the future." Applause followed, thunderous and hollow. Richard thrived in this theater of admiration. He spoke of legacy, of vision, of the monumental deal that would redefine global markets. Every word dripped with triumph, painting a picture of inevitability. As he spoke, Amara watched. Not from the back, not from the shadows, but from a place where every Harrington eye could see her. Calm, unmoved, unapologetically present. Richard concluded with the flourish of a man who believed the world bent to his will. "And so," he declared, lifting his glass, "here's to the future of Harrington Global and Titan Global, a partnership destined to change history." The room erupted in applause. Glasses clinked, cameras flashed. And in that storm of celebration, not a soul noticed the quiet message vibrating through Amara's phone, the signal that everything was in motion. Because while the Harringtons were busy basking in their imagined victory, the man they had courted for months was making a decision that would turn their empire to ash, not out of anger, not out of vengeance, but out of principle. Miles away, in a high-rise office that commanded the city skyline, Daniel Caldwell, Amara's father and CEO of Titan Global, watched a live stream of the event. He had seen enough. The reports from his discreet observers confirmed what he dreaded. The family he was about to entrust with his company's legacy was rotten at its core. Disrespect wasn't just a character flaw, it was a liability. And when that disrespect targeted his daughter, the line wasn't just crossed, it was obliterated. With a single instruction, the merger that was supposed to define the decade was dismantled, quietly, surgically, without a ripple of warning. Lawyers moved like shadows, contracts evaporated, and by the time dessert plates were cleared, the deal was nothing more than dust. And yet, in the ballroom, ignorance reigned. The Harringtons floated on clouds of arrogance, unaware that the ground beneath them was crumbling. Guests mingled, deals were whispered, and Amara? She stood among them, serene as ever, her silence now laced with inevitability. The final act of humiliation would not come from her lips, but from their own stage. A revelation so public, so irreversible, that no amount of spin could contain. And as the night wore on, screens around the ballroom flickered with breaking news alerts. At first, no one noticed. Then, one by one, conversations faltered. Phones buzzed, brows furrowed, whispers turned into gasps. And before Richard Harrington could take another victory lap, the truth detonated in real time. The first tremor was almost invisible, a subtle pause in the rhythm of the room. Glasses still clinked, laughter still rippled, but beneath the surface, something shifted. It started with a phone vibrating on a polished marble table, then another and another. Heads bent over glowing screens, eyebrows furrowed. Conversations stuttered mid-sentence. The ballroom's symphony of indulgence faltered. The orchestra played on, oblivious, as whispers spread like smoke. Someone near the bar gasped, loud enough to turn heads. Then another voice, urgent, disbelieving. "This can't be real." On the giant LED screens that moments ago displayed Richard Harrington's face during his triumphant speech, an alert scrolled across in bold red letters. Breaking. Titan Global terminates 750-minute merger with Harrington Global. Cites ethical concerns. The words flashed like gunfire. Conversations collapsed into chaos. Champagne flutes trembled in manicured hands. Every click of a camera became an execution shot, freezing horror on once smug faces. Richard Harrington didn't move at first. He stood frozen, glass in hand, smile still lingering like a ghost of arrogance. It took a full 5 seconds for the meaning to pierce the armor of his certainty. And when it did, the color drained from his face in an almost theatrical fade. Phones rang. Notifications detonated in rapid fire. Journalists disguised as guests lunged for their devices, their fingers flying as they sent the scandal hurtling into the digital stratosphere. Within seconds, hashtags bloomed like wildfire. Harrington collapse, Titan exit, corporate scandal. Victoria's laugh, so sharp and cruel minutes ago, died in her throat. Bradley muttered something under his breath, disbelief twisting his perfect smile into a grimace. Eleanor, ever the social strategist, reached for composure like a drowning woman reaching for air. Her hand gripped Richard's arm, nails digging into his sleeve. "Richard." It was barely a whisper, but desperation stained every syllable. He moved at last, stalking toward the nearest aide, voice low and lethal. "Find out what this is, now." But the aide, pale and trembling, held up a screen. The headline glared back like a death sentence. Below it, a statement from Titan Global's board. "Effective immediately, Titan Global withdraws from all negotiations with Harrington Global. This decision reflects our commitment to integrity and ethical partnerships." Integrity. Ethical partnerships. The words sliced deeper than any financial blow. They weren't just losing a deal, they were being branded as morally bankrupt on the world stage. Around them, guests began to scatter, their loyalty evaporating like spilled champagne. Investors whispered about stock plunges, about legal fallout, about reputational ruin. The empire Richard Harrington had built, the legacy he intended to immortalize tonight, was collapsing in real time, and the entire world was watching. And then, in the center of the storm, stood Amara Caldwell. Still, silent, untouched by the chaos swirling around her. Her phone buzzed once more. A simple message from her father. "It's done." She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply placed the phone back in her clutch and lifted her gaze to the family that had spent the night mocking her existence. For the first time, Victoria met her eyes fully, and in that gaze, something shattered. Recognition. Not of her name, not yet, but of a truth that clawed its way through denial. This woman mattered. The confirmation came moments later, delivered not by Amara, but by the screens now cycling through every major news outlet's feed. Alongside the breaking headlines appeared a photo, Daniel Caldwell, Titan Global's enigmatic CEO, standing beside a woman with the same poised features, the same quiet strength. The caption burned like acid. Titan Global CEO Daniel Caldwell pictured with daughter Amara Caldwell at last year's Innovation Summit. Gasps ricocheted through the hall. The whispers turned to stunned murmurs, then to an audible swell of disbelief. Daughter. The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. The Harringtons didn't just insult a guest, they humiliated the only person in the room whose opinion truly mattered. Richard's face contorted, rage and realization colliding, in an expression that stripped him of every ounce of dignity. He looked at Amara, as if seeing her for the first time, and in that look was a desperate calculation. Apology, damage control, salvage. But it was too late. The collapse was irreversible, and the irony exquisite. The family that measured worth, in bloodlines, in status, in privilege, had been undone by the very assumptions that fed their arrogance. They wanted a seat at Titan Global's table, and in their blind pursuit, they mocked the person who set the table in the first place. Victoria took a step forward, words forming on lips that once dripped with venom. But Amara moved first, not toward them, not with words, but with something far more devastating. Indifference. She turned away, leaving their empire to rot in the ruin they created. Behind her, the noise swelled into a frenzy, journalists circling like vultures, investors storming toward exits, cameras flashing like lightning over a battlefield. Richard barked orders no one followed. Eleanor clung to vanity as if it could shield her from disgrace. Bradley cursed under his breath, his swagger crumbling into panic. And through it all, Amara walked with the same measured grace she carried into the room. No raised voice, no triumphant declaration. Because true power doesn't announce itself, it simply acts. By the time she stepped into the cool night air, the Harrington name was already trending worldwide, not as a symbol of power, but as a cautionary tale. And Amara? She didn't need revenge. She didn't need their apology. The collapse of their empire was apology enough. But the world wasn't done with the story. By morning, every major outlet would dissect the scandal. Every headline would scream the same brutal truth. $750 million deal destroyed by arrogance. How the Harrington empire fell in a single night. And somewhere high above the city, Daniel Caldwell would look at his daughter and know this. What happened tonight wasn't just business. It was justice. The night air outside the Harrington Tower was cool, sharp, with the scent of rain that threatened to fall. For Amara, it felt cleansing, like the weight of generations of silent humiliation had been rinsed from her shoulders. The world behind her, that glittering palace of arrogance, was collapsing brick by brick. And she hadn't needed to raise her voice, hadn't needed to play their game. She walked toward the waiting car, heels tapping against marble like the closing notes of a symphony. As the driver opened the door, a dozen questions swirled in her mind, but none of them lingered. Because the truth was simple, what happened tonight wasn't an accident. It was inevitability. When power feeds on disrespect, it eventually consumes itself. Across the city, in a penthouse illuminated by floor-to-ceiling glass, Daniel Caldwell watched the chaos unfold through a flood of live broadcasts. The Harrington Gala had become a global spectacle, dissected by analysts and mocked by millions. Daniel's expression remained calm, but beneath that composure was a father's quiet pride. Not for the deal he had just annihilated, but for the daughter who understood the lesson he'd spent a lifetime teaching. Dignity is non-negotiable. By the time Amara reached home, her name was already viral. Screens across the world flashed, her image alongside headlines that blended admiration with awe, the woman who brought down a billionaire family without saying a word. Elegance, power, and principle. Meet Amara Caldwell. Social media exploded. Clips from the gala circulated like wildfire. Amara's serene presence juxtaposed against the Harringtons' unraveling faces. Memes sprouted overnight. Satire accounts reenacted the downfall, and comment sections brimmed with a single sentiment. This is what happens when arrogance meets reality. But for the Harringtons, reality was more brutal than any trending hashtag. Immediate fallout by dawn, financial markets reflected the carnage. Harrington Global's stock plummeted, shedding billions in value in a single trading session. Analysts called it the fastest corporate freefall in recent memory. The phones in Richard Harrington's office rang without mercy, investors demanding answers, partners withdrawing commitments, regulators circling like sharks sensing blood. Richard himself was a shadow of the man who had stood on that stage. Hours earlier, gone was the commanding presence, the unshakable arrogance. In its place was desperation. He spent the early hours clawing at damage control, calling lawyers, strategists, anyone who could pull the noose from around his empire's neck. But every call ended the same: silence, or worse, polite refusals. The merger was dead. The trust was gone. And the stain of scandal couldn't be scrubbed by press releases or staged apologies. This wasn't just a business failure. It was a moral indictment, broadcast to every corner of the corporate world. Eleanor Harrington tried to salvage what little dignity remained, issuing statements steeped in polished language. A misunderstanding, a regrettable series of miscommunications. But the world wasn't buying it. Screens replayed the moment Victoria sneered, the laughter that followed, the mask of entitlement ripped away in high-definition clarity. Victoria herself spiraled under the weight of public scorn. Brands severed partnerships. Fashion houses dropped her from ambassador roles. Every cruel word she had spoken now looped endlessly in viral clips, stripped of context, but rich in consequence. Bradley fared no better. His name trended alongside. Terms like nepotism and privilege implosion. Deals he had banked on evaporated overnight, and through it all, Amara said nothing. No interviews, no statements. Her silence became its own headline, its own weapon. In an age where everyone shouted, her refusal to gloat spoke louder than any victory speech. Behind closed doors, in a boardroom overlooking a skyline painted with morning light, Daniel Caldwell sat at the head of a table flanked by executives. The decision had been unanimous, not just to end the merger, but to make an example of what happens when ethics are treated as an accessory. This wasn't just about them, Daniel said, his voice even, deliberate. It was about the message. Our partnerships reflect who we are. If we bend for money, we stand for nothing. Every word carried weight because the world was watching. Titan Global wasn't losing anything, not really. If anything, its reputation soared, cast as a fortress of principle in an industry marred by compromise. Calls poured in from firms eager to align with a company that valued integrity over profit. The Harringtons had lost a deal. Titan had gained a movement, and at the center of that movement was Amara. Not because she demanded it, but because people demanded her story. They wanted to know the woman who dismantled an empire with grace, who proved that silence can roar louder than scandal. Opinion columns dissected her poise. Influencers praised her restraint. CEOs quoted her without ever hearing her speak. But for Amara, none of that mattered. Fame was never the point. Principle was. And principle doesn't trend for applause. It stands because it must. The personal reckoning, while the world cheered, the Harrington estate became a fortress of denial and despair. Inside its gilded walls, fractures widened into chasms. Richard raged. Eleanor wept. Victoria and Bradley turned on each other in a desperate search for someone to blame. Their empire, once an altar of superiority, became a mausoleum of broken pride. Investors abandoned ship. Lawsuits loomed. The board, terrified of obliteration, began whispering of leadership change. For the first time in decades, the Harrington name, once synonymous with invincibility, became a cautionary tale. Reporters camped outside their gates. Former allies distanced themselves with surgical precision. And in the cruel theater of public opinion, sympathy was scarce. The world didn't just watch them fall, it celebrated. Because arrogance isn't just despised, it's devoured. The quiet aftermath weeks later, the storm began to settle, but its imprint remained. The Harringtons, stripped of their aura, retreated from the spotlight. Richard resigned under the guise of personal reasons. Eleanor vanished from society columns. Victoria and Bradley traded catwalks and nightclubs for lawyers and crisis managers. And Amara. She moved forward, not with vengeance, but with vision. Her father, proud but pragmatic, asked her what she wanted to do with the influence thrust upon her. She had options, book deals, speaking engagements, even offers to launch her own brand. But Amara chose something else. She quietly expanded the Caldwell Foundation, funneling resources into mentorship programs for underrepresented voices in business. Because for her, the true victory wasn't watching the Harringtons fall. It was lifting others to rise. One evening, as the city lights blinked like stars scattered across glass, she stood on her balcony and thought of that night. The chandeliers, the laughter, the sting of casual cruelty. It could have broken her spirit. It could have turned her bitter. Instead, it became the spark that illuminated a truth she already knew. Power isn't in money. It isn't in titles or champagne-soaked rooms. Power is in dignity. Power is in the choice to rise above. And that choice, it will echo far beyond the walls of any ballroom. The final note months later, a business magazine released its annual cover. Story, The New Face of Power. Amara's photograph graced the front, not as a socialite, not as a headline of scandal, but as a symbol of transformation, a woman who changed the game without breaking a sweat. The Harrington name appeared, too, buried deep in the article, a footnote in a cautionary paragraph, a reminder that in the ruthless theater of power, arrogance writes its own obituary. And somewhere in a quiet corner of the world, people still whispered about that night, the night a billionaire family mocked the wrong woman and lost everything, because some stories don't fade. They burn themselves into history, and this one? It burned with the brilliance of poetic justice.